President.
Senator from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today to speak on a topic that I've addressed many times since I came to the Senate in the fall of last year. And having come from running a business and having worked in state government, every day it is still alarming to me the way Washington spends money. In no other place in America, and perhaps no other place in the world, is money spent by an organization without any reference to how much money is being taken in. And unfortunately, Mr. President, the situation has gotten to a point where it is completely unsustainable for this country. We open our newspapers today and we read stories about Greece having to borrow money from the European Union, being so far in debt that the forecast of the country's viability is in question. Yet our country is headed on the same path, but few come to the floor of this chamber and sound the alarm. Well, Mr. President, I will continue to do that for the remainder of the time that I have here in this body, because the future of this country is at peril. And while we have spent too much for many years, the rate and pace of that spending now is beyond control. But it need not be. We need not continue in the ways of spending more money than we can possibly pay back. Let me set the table, if I may, of the financial situation that we're in. Here in 2010, we are about the business of setting up the budget for 2011. You would think the first question we would ask is, how much money do we expect to take in 2011? Well, the number is about $2.2 trillion. Yet the projected budget, how much we're going to spend, is $3.8 trillion. We will run a deficit in this year alone of $1.6 trillion. Now, these numbers are so big. $1 trillion. What is $1 trillion? Well, $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. $1,000 billion. A billion is 1,000 million. The numbers are so hard to fathom. But let me explain, if I can, in a way that I've often talked about here on the floor. If you put dollar bills side to side, you could cover 2 football fields with $1 million. If you laid $1 billion on the ground in $1 bills side to side, you could cover Key West, Florida, in my home state, which has a square area of more than 3 miles. You could blanket the city with $1 bills with $1 billion. $1 trillion will cover the state of Rhode Island twice. And every one of these dollars is a dollar that's been taken from the American taxpayer, a dollar that they could spend on their family, on their children's education, on their home, on needed repairs. We take those dollars and we spend them, and now we spend them beyond an ability to pay them back. So right now, because of the money that we borrow, more than $200 billion a year, $200 billion a year goes to our interest payments alone, paying for the money that we shouldn't have spent in the past. At our current rate of spending, according to this administration, by the end of this decade, 2020, we will have another almost $10 trillion in debt, making our total debt $22 trillion. At that point, our interest payment each year will be $900 billion. And at that point, the budget breaks. At that point, what we call mandatory spending on entitlements like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid will be all of the budget plus the interest. There will be no money for defense. There will be no money for Homeland Security. There will be no money for any of the other programs in government. So if we have this impending crisis, if we are driving the car towards the wall, why aren't we making any changes? Well, today, Mr. President, I'm filing legislation to enact a change, enact a mechanism, an architecture to have a discussion on this floor and on the floor down the hall in the House of Representatives to find a solution to put America back on a stable financial path. And the bill is what I call the 2007 solution. In 2007, the United States economy was still going strong. It wasn't until December of that year that we found ourselves beginning the recession. If I go home to Florida like I did this past weekend and talk to Floridians and say, could you live on what you had in 2007 based on these difficult times? My constituents had more money in 2007 than they have in 2010. So why shouldn't the federal government be able to live on what we spent in 2007? Why can't that be enough? And if we did that, if we froze spending across the board at 2007 levels, when the economy was still going strong, before we injected all this stimulus money, if we go back to a place of normalcy, and trust me, there was plenty of redundant and wasteful spending in 2007, but let's just go back to that as a framework, a benchmark. If we were to cap our spending at 2007 levels, by 2013, we would balance the budget, start running a surplus. By 2020, instead of having a $22 trillion national debt that's unsustainable, we'd have a $6 trillion national debt. We would have cut it in half. And we would have preserved the American dream for our children and our grandchildren. Mr. President, you know, I have 4 small kids. We just had a baby 2 weeks ago. And Max, Taylor, Chase, and Madeline, 6, 4, 2, and 2 weeks. My greatest fear is that someday one of my kids is going to come to me when they're an adult, after they've gone to school, and say, Dad, we're going to move to India or Brazil or Ireland or some other country because the opportunities in that country are better than the ones in the United States of America. Because, Dad, your generation and the generation before so mismanaged this government that you ruined the American dream. Our taxes now are so high to pay for the debt for things that you spent in the past. Our entitlements are so weighty that we can't afford them. So we're going to leave. This solution, this 2007 solution, would solve that problem. So how does it work? Every year under this bill, the majority leader of the United States Senate and the majority leader in the United States House of Representatives would have to come to the floor and file a procedure to allow for 50 hours of debate on this floor and on the floor of the House of Representatives to decide how we are going to make cuts to stay within 2007 levels. And if the majority leader doesn't do it, the minority leader has the opportunity. And if the minority leader doesn't do it, any senator can do it. And then we will have to, for the first time, have an adult conversation about priorities. Maybe then we would call in the agency heads of the different agencies of government who've had 10, 15, 20% plus increases year after year in their budgets for more than a decade. And we would say, can you make some cuts? Can you do things more efficiently? American businesses right now, for the past 3 years, have been making tremendous cuts because they have to. We don't make cuts in our agencies. Our agency heads don't meet with the members of their organizations, the tens and thousands of workers who work in these different agencies, and say, can we do things differently? Can we do things more efficiently? This morning I had the opportunity to speak to a friend of mine who is about to become Speaker of the House of the Florida House of Representatives, a man by the name of Dean Cannon. Right now, the Florida legislature is in session. And guess what? They have to balance their budget. A very unfamiliar notion here in Washington, D.C. And they're cutting billions of dollars from the Florida budget as they did last year, as they did the year before, because revenues are down, because the economy is hurting. So they have 3 choices. They can make cuts, raise taxes, or find new sources of revenue. And right now they're going through the process of cutting because they have to. And they're making responsible leadership decisions. That process does not happen in Washington, D.C. But under this bill, a framework would be provided that would require that debate, require that discussion, would require that focus. The majority of my colleagues in this chamber are more interested in new programs than making the programs we have run more efficiently and effectively. We can't afford new programs. We can't afford the programs we have now. And if we keep blindly looking off and pretending like we don't have this crisis, the car is going to hit the wall. Our children are going to be in a situation where they can't fulfill the American dream. So the 2007 solution says, look, we're just going to have a debate for 50 hours on the floor of this chamber every year about how we could get back to 2007 levels. And it doesn't specify where the cuts should be. Should we make some cuts in the Defense Department? Do we need to reform our entitlement programs? Is there waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicare? We would have those discussions. It would be our governing, focusing principle for at least 50 hours. Do we not have 50 hours to figure out whether or not we can run government more efficiently and effectively? Mr. President, there are hundreds of billions of dollars that we could cut out of the federal government and not impact our constituents back at home. I'm convinced of it. Do we not think that there's 10% waste in our federal agencies who haven't made cuts for more than a decade? If we cut 10% across the board in our federal agencies, we'd save more than $100 billion a year. 20% gets us close to $300 billion. Businesses, families, state governments are doing this right now and been doing it for years. So the 2007 solution, which I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will embrace, just says let's have a discussion. Let's have the architecture in place to get back to a level of sustainable spending. And if we did that, if we were principled about it, we could save this country. It is really to that point. The debt is cascading out of control. Mr. President, I came to this body in September of last year. I stand here on the floor of the United States Senate in April, and we have gone $1 trillion more in debt since I arrived at the United States Senate. $1 trillion in just a 6 or 7 month period. It took us until 1980 in this country's history, from 1789 to 1980, to go $1 trillion in debt. And we just did it in 6, 7 months. Our spending is out of control. We need a solution. We need a framework for a governing leadership discussion, and I believe that this 2007 solution bill can do that. Mr. President, I hope my colleagues will embrace this provision. I hope that we can create an architecture to put America back on the right path. I know that there are people of good conscience on both sides of the aisle, including the man who sits in the chair today, who care about this spending problem. And if we could get past partisanship, if we could get past rhetoric and focus on this issue, we could save America. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.